Coming up next, we're telling the tale of a misunderstood sibling rivalry. We're talking two legendary singer-songwriters who were the driving engines behind one of music's most legendary bands, till it all fell apart. And yeah, it was one hell of a fallout. And that's where we're going with today's episode, the aftermath and all of its wreckage and all its glory. As these two artists went solo, a war of words ensued through their music. Songwriting skirmishes and potshots launched via lyrics, including some low blows. But was it really as bad as it seemed? Well, the answer may surprise you. Today, it's an all-out free-for-all, tell us how you really feel songwriting slugfest, and a multi-song episode that proves that the pen is truly mightier than the sword. Will there be a happy ending? We're going to find out next on Professor of Rock. Hey, music junkies, Professor of Rock, always here to celebrate the greatest artists and the greatest songs of all time. You know, if you know what up, down, left, right, BA start does, or what it means, you're going to dig this channel of deep musical nostalgia. Make sure to subscribe below right now. Click the red button and click the bell so you know when our stuff comes out. We have some great news. We have a new merch provider. We partner with 80stees.com. I'm going to start doing a t-shirt of the day, and the one I wear you can get yourself. Just click on the link below. Get yours today. You can choose from thousands of the coolest t-shirts you'll ever see, and I'm going to wear them every day. Check it out. Actually, you can click on the link up here to get there as well. You know, today we've got a really cool show. I'm excited about this one. I've been wanting to do this for a long time. It's a story of a sibling rivalry. Maybe not literally, but for this band, it comes pretty close. I'm talking about the Beatles, or more specifically, what happened after the band broke up, especially between McCartney and Lennon, Paul McCartney, John Lennon. There were definitely some rough patches there. And I want to take a closer look at the feud between John and Paul and find out, was there really something to it, or has it been overhyped by the media? We're going to find out. The two, of course, engage in an epic war of words throughout their songwriting in their solo career. Even before that, they were like two heavyweight boxers trading punches through their lyrics. And some of those were cheap shots, and they really hit the other guy where it hurts, below the belt. So to tell the story, I'm going to zero in on a few different tracks, including McCartney's John Lennon jab, Too Many People, and then John's ice cold uppercut, How Do You Sleep?
Too many people going underground. How do you sleep?
I'm going to throw in a couple of surprise tracks at the end that will help us round out the story. But to get this thing started, let's do the Cliff Notes version of the breakup of the Beatles and go from there to understand where we're going. Approaching the late 60s, it was clear that each of the Beatles were developing their own artistic agendas. The boy band days, I saw her standing there and I Want to Hold Your Hand, it kind of seemed like light years away. And by 1968's White Album, the cracks within the band had started to show. Ringo Starr left the group for a couple of weeks during the White Album sessions. And then, of course, George Harrison later quit for 5 days during the Get Back rehearsals. A lot of these things are well known. Exacerbating the band's growing internal conflicts was the passing of the Beatles manager Brian Epstein. This happened in August of '67. With Brian gone, Paul pushed for his new father-in-law to manage the band. However, the other Beatles outvoted him in favor of infamous businessman Alan Klein. Not a great choice there. Ultimately, this led to a lawsuit and some really bitter feelings. With the Trouble Get Back project put on hold in 1969, the Beatles continued to record together here and there in the spring and summer, but for the most part, the four band members were increasingly dedicated to projects outside of the band. Really, the last time that John, Paul, George, and Ringo actually recorded together as the Beatles was on August 20th, 1969, of course, during the session for Abbey Road's The End.
And in the end,
a month later, September 20th of 1969, Lennon privately told his bandmates that he was going to leave the band. Jump ahead 7 months to April 1970, and Paul McCartney publicly stated that he was no longer working with them, with the Beatles. Lennon and McCartney in particular, they would remain at odds after the Beatles broke up for sure. Throughout the 70s, each solo Beatle would follow their own trajectory, making the music that they felt that they couldn't create within the confines of the band. George Harrison, for his part, released 6 studio albums during the decade, scored 10 top 40 singles in that process, from the #1 hit My Sweet Lord in 1970 to Blow Away in 1979.
My sweet Lord, just want to make it blow away, blow away, blow away.
Ringo issued 7 studio albums in the 70s, and he had 7 U.S. top 10 singles, including the #1's Photograph and You're 16.
But all I've got is a photograph, and I read that sparkle and shine. You're 16.
John Lennon would release 6 studio albums during the 70s, the lowest of the 4. He brought home 8 top 40 singles.
Give peace a chance. What do you say? Imagine all the people.
But of course, of the 4, it was Paul McCartney with his penchant for writing pop hits on his own and with the band Wings. He was the most commercially dominant of the Fab Four, really the most commercially dominant of all time. Just the guy could write a hit. During the 70s, Paul was the most prolific. He released 9 studio albums, and he scored like 25 U.S. top 40 singles, including 6 that went all the way to #1.
And on the run, find a way to go no matter what the man said. The people would have had enough of a silly love song.
Yeah, but before McCartney filled up the groovy decade with pop hits, there's still some hard feelings and a lot of bad-mouthing going on between Paul and John. In fact, Paul's May 1971 LP, Ram, contained more than a couple of pokes at his bygone bandmate. For example, the song Too Many People, that song references John's lucky break, meaning the Beatles, and how John broke it, the band M2 broke it in 2.
Your lucky break and broke it in 2.
Too Many People also takes exception to John and Yoko's self-images as important political icons. The line that too many people preaching practices, that's aimed squarely at the couple.
Too many people preaching practices.
Now, decades later, in an interview with Mojo magazine, Paul said of that line, and I quote, "I felt that was true of what was going on with John. Do this, do that, do this, do that." And then in his book, Lyrics, 1956 to present, McCartney elaborated, writing why he put John and Yoko in the crosshairs. He said so much of what they held to be truth was crap. War is over? Well, no, it isn't. And not surprisingly, John Lennon felt attacked, and digging deeper into the album, he found what he believed to be other jabs in songs like 3 Legs and Backseat of My Car, though actually McCartney denied that. Said John, and I quote, "There were a few little digs on this album which he kept so obscure that other people didn't really notice them, but I heard them. I heard Paul's messages in Ram. Too many people going where? Missed our lucky what? What was our first mistake? Can't be wrong? Huh? I mean, Yoko, me, and other friends can't all be hearing things." End of quote.
But he can't run.
Well, as it turns out, John Lennon, being the supreme rock poet of his time, he had some ammunition of his own, and it was a lot worse. As he prepared to release his multi-platinum LP, Imagine, that happened just a few months later in September of 71, he didn't hold back. For one, when Imagine was originally released, it contained a postcard of John holding the ears of a large pig. This was his way of making fun of Paul's cover for Ram, where Paul is holding the horns of a ram. But where John really took it to Paul was in the lyrics of his song, How Do You Sleep? It's infamous. Not one to take things lying down, John Lennon couldn't resist piling on the potshots. I mean, potshot after potshot. Each line of How Do You Sleep is an attack on some aspect of McCartney's life or his music or, for that time. For example, the first verse begins with Lennon singing, "So Sergeant Pepper took you by surprise, you better see right through that mother's eyes." Those freaks was right when they said you was dead. The one mistake you made was in your head.
in your head.
Here, among other things, John alluded to the famous Paul's dead myth. Of course, we recently dedicated an entire episode to unraveling that urban legend if you're interested. Spoiler alert, Paul is very much alive. But here in How Do You Sleep, John isn't saying that Paul is literally dead. Rather, he's saying he's dead artistically. And that idea is a big part of how John approaches the lyrical assault from there. Case in point, verse 2, John sings, "The only thing you've done was yesterday, and since you've gone, you're just another day."
You done was yesterday.
Of course, that's a double song reference. First line refers to the Beatles' 1965 #1 hit, Yesterday, which was sung and written by Paul, though like all their compositions, is credited to Lennon and McCartney. But that's really brutal. The second line, that's blasting Paul's first solo single, Another Day.
Yesterday, and she finds it hard to stay awake. It's just another day.
Of course, John's scorching declaration here is that Paul McCartney's best work is behind him, and that, no longer with the Beatles where he had John to lean on. That's what he's implying. And of course, anything after the Beatles isn't worth listening to. And then in verse 3, John calls Paul nothing but a pretty face, implying that the songwriter really has nothing of substance to offer and that within a year or two it will be pretty obvious. Now, driving his point home with one more dig, John then sings, "The sound you make is music to my ears." That refers to background music, elevator music. It's definitely one of the most brutal takedowns in rock history. Now, although John took sole credit for writing How Do You Sleep, there are others who reportedly contributed to the lyrics, which made it even worse, though who contributed what isn't 100% clear. Among those who were there for the writing, recording sessions, George Harrison was there. He played the slide guitar on the track. Ringo, who was just visiting, was there. Yoko, of course. Then there was manager Alan Klein and bassist and Beatles friend Klaus Vormann, as well as several other musicians like Nicky Hopkins, John Trout, and Alan White. But whether or not any of them offered up their own shots for John to use, just the fact that Paul's friends and associates played on the song, that made it sting even more. Can you even imagine? Though in Ringo's defense, he was reportedly pretty upset by what was happening and he told John to knock it off. Also there in studio was writer Felix Dennis, who claims that Alan Klein and Yoko wrote some of the lyrics. In particular, he remembers that Yoko raced into the studio to show John what she had come up with, and the two burst out laughing. Actually, according to Felix, the final version of How Do You Sleep is much nicer than John originally intended. He said, and I quote, "Thank God a lot of it never actually got recorded because it was highly, highly personal." Man, I can't even imagine what it was. Obviously, How Do You Sleep was written to get under Paul's skin. However, John claimed that he was just using his former partner for songwriting inspiration. Said Lennon about it, and I quote, "It was like Dylan doing Like a Rolling Stone, one of his nasty songs. It's using somebody as an object to create something. I wasn't really feeling that vicious at the time, but I was using my resentment towards Paul to create a song. It was just a mood." Or as John would say on another occasion, it was sibling rivalry, not a vicious vendetta. Paul McCartney would admit in a 2020 interview with GQ that How Do You Sleep did get to him. He was really bothered by it. Paul said, and I quote, "You hear the stories from various angles, and apparently people who were in the room when John was writing that, he was getting suggestions for the lyrics of Alan Klein. So you see the atmosphere of let's get Paul, let's nail him in a song. But even though it was painful, How Do You Sleep more or less finished the John-Paul public squabble. After the song came out, Lennon confirmed that there was no feud between him and Paul. It was all just good, clean fun. He explained that he had started writing the song clear back in 1969 before Paul even released Ram, and that the line "So Sgt. Pepper Took You by Surprise" was written about 2 years before anything even happened. McCartney's next album, Wildlife, that was released in December of '71, the same year as both Ram and Imagine, and it virtually ignored the situation from there. and John, for his part, never directly attacked Paul through song ever again. Now, according to John, there had always been musical differences between the two songwriters. It's not like it just happened after the breakup. In fact, when the Beatles were trying to get through the endless sessions for Paul's sing-along ditty, Obla Di Obla Da, John was apparently annoyed as hell. According to famous engineer Jeff Emmerich, he said, and I quote, "This was a McCartney composition that Lennon openly and vocally detested. John called it Paul's granny music shit." But despite that, they also had so much in common, and they still did after the Beatles. John Lennon would say, "The thing that made the Beatles what they were was the fact that I could do my rock and roll and Paul could do the pretty stuff. And sometimes the two could really inspire one another." Okay, so let's continue the story by fast forwarding to Paul McCartney's second official solo album. A lot of it was with Wings. A lot of people get that confused. But his second solo album, aptly named McCartney 2, was released a day short of a decade after his first solo album, McCartney. Initially, it was conceived as an extensive double LP, but Paul had to be convinced to edit it down to just one vinyl. Now, like its 1970 predecessor, McCartney 2 found Paul playing every single instrument all by himself, and Linda added background vocals. I mentioned this record in particular because of one key track, Paul's 1980 single Coming Up. For this one, Paul played bass, synthesizer, guitar, drums, and piano. And the music video comically plays on this idea, with Paul and Linda being the only two people in the video, but between them playing all the 12 band members. Mostly Paul is, changing. Coming Up was a massive hit worldwide, starting in America, where it went to number 1 on the Billboard Hot 100 and number 2 on the US Cashbox chart. It was the live version that hit in America, and it was released without Paul's permission. He was really upset about that one. Can't believe that they did that, but the live version is better than the regular version, in my opinion. But Coming Up is Paul telling that special someone to stick around because he's coming up like a flower. The song's message, though not directed at John Lennon, seems to be one that he took to heart. As the story goes, Lennon was on a yachting trip in the Caribbean. This was in 1980, and he heard it on the radio. He'd been out of the music game for a long time. He hadn't released a new album since Rock and Roll, and that was in February 75, for half a decade. But John heard Coming Up, and it inspired him to get back into music after taking such a long vacation from it. He returned to the studio just months after hearing that, and he got to work on Double Fantasy. That's what inspired him. That's really cool. Just like of course, the multi-platinum Double Fantasy came out on November 17th of 1980. And sadly, it would be John Lennon's last album released. We all remember what happened just weeks later, December 8th, 1980. John Lennon was tragically gunned down and killed outside of his New York apartment. Lennon's murder, it really brought the world to its knees. One of the saddest days of the 20th century. With Lennon's death, any hope of a Beatles reunion was gone. There would never, ever be a reunion of the Fab Four. It was just a jarring and a devastating end to an era. The days when all four Beatles walked the earth. Now, by most accounts, Paul McCartney had tried to stay in touch with his former bandmate over the years. But, John Lennon, he usually rebuffed the outreach. The last time that the two saw each other was 2 years before Lennon's death, when they shared dinner in New York. But Paul would also say that by the time of the tragedy, they become mates again. What he would say about it is how that was so cool. It was the saving grace, because it got a bit sticky after the Beatles. No, we were really good mates again. It was lovely, actually. Actually, in a 2008 interview with the Times of London, McCartney reflected on his reply to John's decades-old jab, "How do you sleep?" and on his relationship with Lennon. He said, "The answer to John was, well, I was sleeping very well at the time. Before John died, I got back a good relationship with him, and that was very special. The arguments we had just didn't matter. We were able to just take the piss about all those songs. They weren't that harsh. In fact, I've been thanked by Yoko and everyone else for saving the Beatles from Alvin Klein. Everything comes around in the end. And as proof of Paul's feelings, he wrote another song directed at John. But this one was a sweet dedication to his best friend. A posthumous reconciliation, if you will, called Here Today. You can hear it on Paul's 1982 album, Tug of War.
If you were here today.
McCartney described the song as a conversation he never had with Lennon. And since it had never happened, it was just him talking to John inside his head. One day he was just sitting quietly in his little room with his guitar and these chords just started coming out. And Paul started having these thoughts, as if he were talking to John about their relationship. And he started writing out all those things that he wanted to say to his fallen friend that he never was able to.
Here today.
In the song, Paul sings of meeting John. He talks about their time in the Beatles together. He reflects on their differences for sure, but he also says that John was always there with a smile.
But you were always there with a smile.
Now, ultimately, Paul, he called his relationship with John Lennon a family relationship. No matter what, they were brothers through and through. They fought, but they truly loved each other. And despite the hard times, when it came down to it, Paul was so grateful to have had John in his life. And this song is, Paul going on record expressing his love, his true love for his brother. It's just one of the most beautiful songs of McCartney's career, truly.
Probably laugh and say that we were worlds apart.
Here Today, it's always meant the world to me. I remember when I took my dad to see McCartney in concert before he passed away. Paul played this song and he dedicated it to John. And I watched my dad, and he wasn't a crying guy, but I watched him tear up as Paul played it live. And I remember he put his arm around me and he squeezed my shoulder.
And I am holding back the tears.
And then years later, I sang this song at my dad's funeral. In some ways, it described our relationship.
I love you.
And it described our connection that we had with the Beatles. The Beatles were like this bond between me and my dad. He saw him at Ed Sullivan when he was just 11 years old, and that's what started this crazy journey for me. I want to end on the most touching part of Here Today, where Paul sings, and I quote, "And if I say I really loved you and was glad you came along, if you were here today, for you were in my song, here today."
Here today.
Thanks so much for watching. Leave us a comment about Paul McCartney and John Lennon. What do you think about their solo careers? What are your memories of these songs? I just love, it's bittersweet because they had those songs where they fought and they called each other out. But in the end, it was the beautiful relationship that the two of them had that gave us the greatest music in the history of the world. So let's have a great discussion and celebrate that below. If you like our content, we invite you to subscribe. We would love to have you as part of our community. Until next time, 3 chords and the truth, my friends.